It's Dr. Jerome Corsi, and today it's Wednesday. It's October 25th, 2023. Thank you for joining us on The Truth Central. We're doing podcasts every weekday. I have a new book out now, which is just, in fact, just being published right now. It's up on Amazon. It's The Truth About Neo-Marxism, Cultural Maoism, and Anarchy. And it's exposing woke lies in this age of disinformation. It's a substantial book. I mean, it's a book that runs something like 400 pages, and it's got 1,441 footnotes in it. And it's one of the works I've been really building and studying for a lifetime to do, because it really shows the insanity that we're going through with this cultural Maoism that now is pervading the world, and this neo-Marxism that is leading us, I think, into a path of the destruction of capitalism. It was what their intent is. And the process we're going to have experiencing chaos and anarchy right now. As I review the news and see, the world is supporting Hamas in Israel's conflict. Hamas is backed by Iran. Iran is also supporting Hezbollah. And there's a growing sentiment in the world that Israel is an illegitimate state. Now, if this happens, we're headed toward the, biblically, a conflict in the Middle East that could trigger a thermonuclear war. And unfortunately, one of the conclusions I'm coming to in this book, and I think everyone should really get into it deeply, is that this insanity that we've allowed our news agencies, our universities, the entire really elite culture, which has been pervaded by this neo-Marxist ideas that we are a racist country and that we need to fundamentally change America, as Obama said. These are underlying concepts that will ultimately destroy civilization as we know it. And they're intended to, because the neo-Marxists believe they can only create by destroying. They have to destroy the existing order in order to create a new one. And we hear George H.W. Bush talking about a new world order. That means the destruction of the old world order. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing China. Stocks are being sold left and right because China is going into a deep economic recession. Here in the United States, one is brewing. We talked about this at length. And we're going to get into it. I definitely want people to get this free book. I'm going to talk about it through the course of this, but the free book, which is The Coming Global Crash and the Historic Gold Rush that's going to occur. Gold is struggling to get over $2,000 an ounce. And Chris is showing it to you. Please get a free copy of this from Swiss America by calling 1-800-519-6268. I'll repeat that, 1-800-519-6268 to get a free copy of this book, The Coming Global Crash and the Historic Gold Rush. I've co-authored it with Dean Heskin of Swiss America. I think if you'll get into this, you'll see, in fact, that we are at a precipice right now where we're teetering on the fact that we could have a massive crash in commercial real estate with all of the buildings that are vacant. When these have to be refinanced, they're going to be facing a loss because they're not worth what they were pre-pandemic, when the buildings were full of occupants going to work every day. Today, people are not going to work every day, and it is a big loss on Wall Street. And the banks are going to be affected by this. We're going to have more bank closures. I'm telling people to prepare for a very, very deep recession that's coming. And 1-800-519-6268 and talk to Swiss America about getting some gold, because it will appreciate in value. Your dollars are losing purchasing power. You can take your dollars losing in purchasing power and buy gold, and it will appreciate in value. Now, I want to talk about Howard Zinn to start, because, again, this is one of the points I make in my book. When you take a look at, when Lincoln when Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, he fundamentally redefined America to say that all people are created equal. And, we now are in the second decade, but we're now in a decade where what has been defined as America is under challenge. So the radical elite left, running our nation's educational institutions, have now indoctrinated generations of Americans, first the millennials, now the Gen Z Zoomers. These are the first two generations to reach adulthood having been taught to hate America as a racist country. This is going back to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, when the Southern states would not give up slavery. And our founding fathers faced a decision. They knew that they could create a country which was based on limited government, but they could not eliminate slavery because the Southern states wouldn't go for it. So they compromised. And that compromise created a flaw in the Constitution that allowed slavery to continue existing. It's a fatal flaw in the founding of the nation. And they knew it at the time. It ultimately led to the Civil War, even though the cause of the Civil War was states' rights, whether the states had a right to abdicate from the Union or whether once the Union was formed, they could not abdicate. They couldn't withdraw and not be part of the Union any longer. Now, on November 19th, 1863, Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. And Gary Wills, who is an historian and of some note, I've always enjoyed Gary Wills' writing, said that the Lincoln's Gettysburg Address does not address slavery, yet it's one of the core themes. What Will wrote is the Gettysburg Address does not mention Gettysburg, nor slavery, nor more surprisingly, the Union, certainly not the South. The other major message of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, is not mentioned, much less defended or vindicated. That's a surprising feature of the Gettysburg Address when you really look at it. The great task mentioned in the address is not emancipation, but the preservation of self-government. We assume today that self-government implies self-rule by blacks as well as whites. By the time of the Gettysburg Address, this was not the case. The push had to be for getting suffrage for African Americans. The Gettysburg Address, for all its artistry and eloquence, does not directly address the most difficult issues of that historical moment. But yet it's become an authoritative expression of the American spirit. That's what Gary Wills properly points out, because it really redefines the Declaration, takes the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, and reads that into the Constitution, which did not eliminate slavery. That's a fundamental point. So Lincoln took the proposition that all men are created equal. He put that into our founding principles when it was really not in our founding principles. That was a fundamental redefinition. And it turned America onto the path of eliminating slavery, which historically in the United States and England was a massive historical moment. And yet, when we take the American left today, what we find is that the American left refuses to acknowledge the shift that Lincoln engineered. So we come to Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn was an historian, and Howard Zinn was an admitted anarchist and socialist. He called himself a democratic socialist. Now, democratic socialism is really the kind of code word for those who are radically left and are aiming to destroy America through this massive kind of engineered change that we're going through. What we're seeing today in the destruction of the economy, the destruction of the middle class, the wars, these are not accidental. The powers that be are determined to bring America down. So what Zinn wrote in his People's History of the United States, which is a leftist history of the United States, defining the United States as a racist country. And I have a copy of the book. I've had it for years. Actually, it was signed by Howard Zinn. And Howard Zinn, I think, did more to set the stage for woke than maybe any other American, except for maybe Saul Alinsky. We'll cover him in a minute. But what Zinn wrote in chapter 2 was that there's not a country in the world in which racism has been more important for so long a time as the United States. So in chapter 2, drawing the color line, Zinn argued that even Thomas Jefferson, in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, was a racist. Zinn explained it as follows. Thomas Jefferson had written a paragraph of the Declaration accusing the king of transporting slaves from Africa to the colonies and suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this this horrible commerce. This seemed to express moral indignation against slavery and the slave trade. Jefferson's personal distaste for slavery must be put aside, despite the fact he owned hundreds of slaves to the day he died. Behind it was the growing fear among Virginians and some other Southerners about the growing number of black slaves in the colonies, 20% of the total population, and the threat of slave revolts. Jefferson's, so basically Zinn is saying that Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder, and Thomas Jefferson's declaration that all men are created equal was in reality, a statement affirming white male privilege. So he completely twists around Jefferson by stating that Jefferson was a slaveholder, so therefore Jefferson and all men were created equal was really a statement that white men are created equal. Okay, now this is one of the fundamental principles of the woke movement, attacking white privilege and attacking white supremacy. In other words, anyone who believes in the Constitution, even the Department of Justice today, is saying that Catholics who like the Latin Mass are terrorists or white supremacists. Well, again, this is a fundamental undermining of society, in that the vast majority, in my lifetime, I've seen a reversal of racism. When I was a child, racism was very apparent, and blacks lived in a miserable condition. And Martin Luther King, when he began the civil rights movement in the 1960s, was not for woke attacking whites. He said, let's be colorblind. Race is not a important characteristic, and we don't need to focus and divide society over it. Okay, but when Zinn wrote his History of America, he made racism the center of his attack. Now, we covered in a previous one of these broadcasts how, going back to Bella Dodd, who testified as a communist before the House on Affairs Activities Committees in 1953, pointed out that one of the architecting of Marxism in America was to take the issue of slavery, to take the issue of race, and to jam that home as a dividing concept, to make America divisive and to create conflict, which would then in turn undermine society. So today, we not only have the attack on race, we have the attack on males. And so the idea that there's more than one gender is distinct from sex, and you can be whatever gender you want to be, is one of the confusing ideas. I want to cover two themes on this. Number one is, if we go to another thinker, Saul Alinsky advanced these principles by saying essentially we should rub raw these tensions. We should accelerate tension in order to cause division in society, which would then lead to a revolution. And so there's an engineering here of when first Marx thought workers of the world would unite because the capitalists were keeping the capital and the workers were being oppressed, their labor was being subjugated to the interests of capital. It shifted to now where we're saying, and the current focus, that didn't work. In 1848, when European nations revolted, it was not a workers' revolt. Workers actually got improved conditions. The labor movement came along, workers got even better conditions. So the fundamental Marxist theory failed. But when we go to Saul Alinsky revives this in the 60s, and it's followed with Howard Zinn carrying on, piling on top of it. And the ultimate advocate of this is Barack and Michelle Obama, who became very much in Chicago influenced by Saul Alinsky. So Steve Coughlin and Richard Higgins, to whom I dedicate this book, they're two brilliant gentlemen, and one of them, Richard Higgins, died during the pandemic. He was put in a hospital. I think basically the treatment he got in the hospital from COVID killed him. At any rate, they wrote a book called Remembering the Misremembered Left, the Left's Strategies and Tactics to Transform America. And Coughlin and Higgins wrote, Marx recognized that Hegel's dialectic does not advance cultures under its sway, but rather nihilizes them, destroys them. Marx envisioned a critical philosophy to tear down Western culture and a proletariat of middle-class nihilists to do so. From Marx to Alinsky, a dark, destructive, nihilist strain that runs through the left is characterized by the numerous homages to Satan et al. So we realize that Alinsky took his book, which was Rules for Radicals, and he dedicated it to Satan. He said Satan was a rebel. He rebelled against the established authority, and for that he received a kingdom. The kingdom he received was hell. Alinsky said things in interviews, and did a Playboy interview, and he said that he'd be more comfortable in hell than in heaven. He thought that Satan really rules Earth, and that Earth is a place where there's only misery, there's only suffering, and that as long as we play by God's rules, we are condemned to live lives that are short, as Thomas Hobbes said, nasty, short, brutal, and cruel. He said nasty, cruel, brutal, and short. I always thought with Thomas Hobbes, it wouldn't have been bad. It was nasty, cruel, brutal, and long, but to top it all off, it's short. So the way Alinsky and Marx and the others saw it, they're fundamentally rebelling against God's law that condemns us to death, that nobody gets out of here alive. And they hate that. They want to be the gods. They want to make the rules. And to do so, they want to destroy God's order. That's fundamentally what's at stake here. So the neo-Marxists, as I explain in this book, have shifted. They've shifted from a class conflict to realizing that you can create conflict over divisions of any kind. And the preferred division for the United States has been race, because of this fatal flaw in the Constitution where the Southern states in 1787 wouldn't budge on slavery. Now, that the Civil War was fought over states' rights, and that Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address, did not address these issues, was brilliant, and that Lincoln was putting them at the forefront. And he was going to the heart of the issue, saying that all men are created equal. He did the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln knew that in his heart, this was not going to be solved until we eliminated the racial divisions. Now, largely Americans have. When I was a kid, you wouldn't see blacks in major cities. They were kept in ghettos. Okay, today you'll see white kids with black athletes wanting to be photographed with them because their black athletes are their stars. You know, when I was a kid growing up in Cleveland, Jimmy Brown was playing for the Cleveland Browns, it was a big deal because here's a black man who was excelling on football and was becoming a hero across the country, still is a hero. So these divisions are deep in America, and it's been a challenge to overcome them. But again, you have a whole group of people who are doing everything they can to intensify these conflicts. And when you go from Marx through to Alinsky, Howard Zinn in the process, and you find that Obama and Michelle in Chicago. Michelle was Hillary Clinton had gone to Alinsky and done her, senior thesis on Alinsky, working with him in person to write that thesis. And Michelle writes a thesis about how, blacks are oppressed, even though she's in a privileged university at Princeton. And Obama is working to organize voters in a campaign that is extending into, the first issues of how elections can be engineered, how election results can be altered, the techniques of getting voters on the lists and voting them. So the whole aim of fundamental change to America, translated, means Marxism. And it supports Obama. When I was in Israel in 2009, right after the election, Obama was at that time, he was in the Middle East, and he was giving speeches in Cairo to groups that included Hamas, where he was saying, and Muslim Brotherhood, he was saying that he had experienced Islam on 3 continents, even though he had done everything he could to join Reverend Wright's church in Trinity Church in Chicago, which was known to be a radical church. Reverend Wright himself was a Marxist, and he gave speeches that Hannity at that time was playing on television, which was GD America, a sermon which he said that and proclaimed that from the pulpit. So when we're talking about hating America, we're talking about embracing Satan. We're talking about that Satan rules here. These people have learned how to fight a cultural war, destroying and undermining the culture. And to do so, they've also focused on sex, because they're saying, again, we need uninhibited sex. That's where Herbert Marcuse, who follows in the Frankfurt School, another line of Marxism that pervades American thinking. When I was in graduate school, Marcuse's book were being read widely. Eros and Civilization was everywhere in a paperback edition. And what that book proclaimed, which I cover in this book, right, was that Marquis de Sade was a hero. Well, Marquis de Sade wrote some of the most twisted pornography, become famous for it, but it is sadistic in nature. It has a undercurrent that, Marcuse, there's Eros and Civilization. That was a later version of it. There was a blue cover of it that was popular in the 60s. I may even have a copy of the original paperback. But again, it was a book that proclaimed sex. And in the 60s, you had the combination of Alinsky, the Vietnam War and the protests, and it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And this was a attempt to undermine the fundamental culture of the Enlightenment, the fundamental culture of the Constitution, which is dedicated to free enterprise, the ability to work, the ability to create businesses, the ability to venture into capital, to create wealth. And what the left is aiming at doing is destroying that. And I cover in both of these books, this is the first book about climate change, Truth About Energy, Global Warming, and Climate Change, how the left orientation of the climate change movement begins with the depopulation movement, how the early depopulationists after World War II, Harrison Brown, for instance, starting it, a nuclear physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project, developing the atomic bomb, wrote a series of books after World War II saying there are too many people and we have to eliminate people. We have to go to government control of birth. We have to make sure that we do not utilize all the resources of the world. And then John Holdren got involved, and he said, well, let's talk about climate change and existential threat. Hydrocarbon fuels burn. When they burn, they emit carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. Let's say since the Industrial Revolution, we've had greenhouse gas increase because more carbon dioxide is released with more hydrocarbon fuels being burned to fuel the Industrial Revolution. Therefore, the Earth's temperature shot up in a dangerous way, like a hockey stick. Okay, so the Earth was copacetic in temperature until the Industrial Revolution. The handle of the hockey stick was even, and then the Industrial Revolution, and the Earth's temperature shot up. It's a lie. It's not how the Earth's climate works. But yet, the fundamental last stroke in all of this was the combining it with postmodernism. The postmodernists deny that there's objective reality, that everything is subjective, so you can posit the values you want to live by. And they're positing a set of values which the globalists are happy to turn into their own, which is a select group, an oligarchy, ruling, controlling the resources of all Earth with their machines, and don't need human beings who are nasty, miserable, going to die, need to eat, need to be taken care of, need health. The elite aren't interested in serving people. They're interested in perpetuating their own lives in luxury. Chris, would you like to comment on this? I've covered a lot here and pulled things together, and I'm going to go for a minute after we're finished with this and focus on today and what we're experiencing happening in the world.
Well, that's what we're going into anyway, because you watch. I was growing up in the 70s and 80s. I was going to elementary school, then junior high, then high school. It's around the time where a lot of school districts were implementing the Howard Zinn history, if you will, people's history, kind of integrating it in there. Nowadays, you see full-grown adults who only read headlines on the internet, thinking that the world history is made up of only oppressors and victims, no gray matter whatsoever. That's great for a let's put it this way: we'll call it a revolutionary movement, but it's now an establishment movement, if you will, by the far left, the Marxists and the globalists of the world. They find it easier to control people if the information's out there in easy sound bites, and it basically pulls people downward into a collective mentality. And this is what happens. It's easy to look at things bipolar: oppressors, victims. Oppressors bad, victims good. It's then that's these are where people who think Kamala Harris's speech about, well, the bigger country invaded a smaller country, and when a bigger country invades a smaller country, that means a smaller country got invaded by a bigger country, makes sense. This is where people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez become considered eloquent and useful leaders of the future. This is what happens. This is what they created.
If you hate America right now,
right,
you're going to get attention.
Yeah, it's the hip thing, right?
Okay, now if you take a look at the headlines and what's being covered, the anti-Trump movement is horrendous right now. It's in ascendancy again.
Right.
So we're having these convictions. Sidney Powell pleading guilty in Georgia to having tried to rig an election.
Did you watch John Ellis yesterday?
Yes, I did. That was very disturbing yesterday because Jenna Ellis was a powerful force saying that there was election interference and there was election fraud.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that issue had been raised by Hillary Clinton and no one did anything about it. And she was not punished for it. She wasn't trying to steal an election. What they want to say is that Biden's election can't be questioned.
Right.
It was he won. And so therefore, if you're questioning that, you're subverting government. You're now a terrorist. You're trying to undermine a legitimate president. Now,
she sounded more scared than.
Well, I've been through this. I mean, the Justice Department wanted to put me in prison because
right.
I did not have a tie to Julian Assange. I wouldn't stand before a judge and swear to a lie to keep myself out of prison. I wouldn't do it. Now, you pay a big price for that. Economically, having to fight these people is expensive. And they put you through hell that you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison. They're going to ruin your life unless you do what they want you to do. And the Justice Department here is the ones who are lying. That's the problem. They become political.
Mm-hmm.
And so what the left has done is managed to capture these institutions. It was Gramsci, and Gramsci did not really invent the phrase, the march through the institutions. Mao had this long march in China, which he took his army, his followers, and he went to a part of China that was remote where he grew up, was isolated, and he rebuilt his strength to continue his civil war against Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist Chinese. And ultimately Mao won. Now, the Long March was part of the strategy Mao used to win. So Gramsci, who is an Italian communist, comes along and says, we'll do a long march through the institutions. We will take every institution and we'll make it move in a direction that's left. We'll make it move in a direction that undermines capitalism, undermines God. Fundamental is eliminating God. That's the first thing that has to be done. And once you've eliminated God, you've gotten control over human beings because now they have no moral compass. And we begin in the streets to see just violence. The streets become dangerous. And once this force is unleashed worldwide, which it's being, so go back to John Ellis, and Sidney Powell, break them economically, and then threaten them with prison. And most people will do what you ask them to do at that point. Because they say a misdemeanor and a $5,000 penalty and 5 years probation is tolerable compared to spending the rest of your life in a prison cell. And why? Because you questioned an election. Now, elections have been questioned in this country basically since the beginning of the country. Some of the earliest fights we had in Congress were over presidential elections and outcomes of presidential elections. And there was a lot of fighting over it. Thomas Jefferson was involved in it. I mean, these are rancorous debates over who won, who lost, whether the election was fair or not. And vote switching and fraud have always been one of the major undermining characteristics that threaten free elections. So it's legitimate to question them, but not if you are in this leftist mentality, which is that they are so convinced that they are right that they will not tolerate any questioning, because then you're repressive. You're destroying things. They're the ones destroying things. Now, how do you judge this? My ultimate litmus test is very biblical again. What's the fruit of the tree? What does the tree produce? Okay, well, this tree produces confusion, anarchy. We see our cities filled with homelessness. We are now having cities that are inundated with illegal immigrants, hotels occupying illegal immigrants in New York City and other cities, cities that are facing bankruptcy increasingly because the tax base is diminished after COVID, with workers not going back to work and buildings losing value. When those buildings have to be refinanced, it's going to be a massive crisis. I see foreclosures coming because people are getting behind on their credit cards. They're getting behind on their auto payments. They're getting behind on their mortgages. So this is all a crash. This is the kind of anarchy. We just went through the pandemic, a lockdown. I never in my life thought you could lock down a whole nation, lock down a whole Western civilization over a pandemic, which was bad flu. So the powers that be that aim to destroy have gained control of the levers of government and have learned the techniques of propaganda. And as such, when the Palestinians say the hospital was attacked by Israel, that becomes front page news in the New York Times without having researched whether it was true, because it sounded right. It was the right rhetoric. The Jews were attacking people in hospitals. That was a story they wanted to, the whole history of the Holocaust, the history of 6 million Jews being exterminated by Hitler in concentration camps and ovens, burned, gassed to death, and then their bodies cremated. That's no longer part of the historical memory because, again, most of the people born today or living today have no actual memory of World War II. World War II generation is dying. And so we are now at a change where if this destructive ideology takes hold, we will march down the path towards World War III and nuclear war, and we're headed down that path right now. Chris?
Imagine that. The people who always propagated peace and simplicity are the ones who have engineered the situation we are in today.
Well, that was a quotation I read. from Howard Zinn. I go and I read it again. That Marx recognized that Hegel's dialectic does not advance cultures under its sway, but it rather nihilizes them. It destroys them. Marx envisioned a critical philosophy to tear down Western culture and a proletariat of middle-class nihilists to do so. From Marx to Alinsky, a dark, destructive, nihilistic strain that runs through the left as characterized by numerous homages to Satan. That's unfortunately the theme today. That's unfortunately what we're seeing. And I'm seeing it headlines all over the place, whether it's Western Europe, which is now going to come into winter with another energy crisis. In 1973, we had the Yom Kippur War, followed by the OPEC oil embargo. Today, we've got the Hamas-Israel war, and OPEC is slowing down oil production to raise prices. We've got a repeat of that cycle. 2008, 2009, we had subprime mortgage fail. People were giving houses that couldn't afford it, pay adjustable rate mortgages when interest rates rose. Today, we've got high interest rates, we've got inflation, we've got stagflation coming, and we're going to have a great crash. We are on the road to destruction right now, and it's intentional because the left believes it can only destroy. It imagines creating, but when the left gains power, it murders millions of people.
Does it imagine creating, or does it create the illusion that they're creating? Remember,
Yes.
oversimplification. Zinn, and we go back to Zinn. Howard Zinn's oversimplification of history, okay, led to a slightly lower mentality and I'll say it again, a dumbing down, an intentional dumbing down of our education system and the nation, in order for the Marxist forces and the Marxists who have been planning this, to take a couple of generations to finally control the minds of younger Americans.
Well, this is the point we're at today, and all of the John Lennon's imagine, there were no God, imagine there were no borders, imagine all the wonderful things we could do if we are the dreamers. Why don't you join us? Well, what they're dreaming is utopia that never happens. And when you finally read Marcuse and all of these other people saying, what do they really want? They imagine a world of sex, not working, abundance, just somehow magically being produced. And the reality of human life is that it requires labor in order to eat and live. It requires labor and discipline and education. I mean, Oregon, I think, is just passing laws now where you can graduate with high school and you don't have to be able to read. They don't want any, they don't want any disciplined learning. In fact, I think they basically want people stupid.
They don't want the peasants to rise up and think.
Well, this is the condition we're in right now, and it is going to get worse before it gets better. And I'm encouraging people to protect yourself, and what's coming is going to be very difficult. And prepare. So put the number again, Chris. I want people definitely to get this copy of this free book. And I'm going to 1-800-519-6268. It's not a very difficult book to read, but you'll be enlightened as to what's going on in terms of the economics, the destruction of the dollar, the rise of the BRICS nations, the rise of cryptocurrency, digital currency, the attempts to control, and in fact that we're going back into stagflation. And what's happened before, we've had gold surge in these periods of time. Under Jimmy Carter, when we were in a similar position, we got to $843 an ounce of gold when Ronald Reagan took over in 1980. Then we had the collapse of the subprime market. That we're getting both crises. This is a double whammy. 1973, we're getting Carter, and we're getting subprime mortgage collapse. And instead, it's going to be commercial real estate and homes collapsing. And during the pandemic, gold went to $2,000 an ounce. What's coming, central banks have stocked up on gold. Gold could go easily to $4,000 an ounce before this is over. This is Dr. Jerome Corsi. Today is Wednesday. It's October 25th, 2023. In the end, God always wins. God will win here too. We're going to experience the judgment of God. It's begun. People say this is end days. Well, it's end days for a changing into a new era. And that new era is either going to be complete destruction, or we're going to emerge more powerful on it because we resist these evil impulses. So join me, please, in 2 Corinthians 7:14. Let's get down on our knees and ask God to forgive us for letting the country get into this situation, for allowing this evil to run free through earth. Remember the Lord's Prayer. May God's will be done here and on earth as it is in heaven. God's will prevail. We should be on the side of God's will, wanting to bring it forward, as difficult as that may be in these times. But in the end, God will win. And I'm hopeful that enough of us will be joining, not John Lennon and the dreamers imagining their utopia on earth, but the worshipers who acknowledge God and understand that this is a spiritual place, a spiritual existence, not a material one, and not one meant to last forever. Dr. Jerome Corsi, thank you for joining us. It's Wednesday, October 25th, 2023. We'll be back tomorrow. God bless.